The rhythmic thud of the axe against pine echoed through the Oregon wilderness, each strike a meditation Jake Morrison had perfected over 3 years of self-imposed exile. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the crisp October air, and his calloused hands gripped the worn handle with the desperation of a man trying to split more than just wood. He was cutting away memories, chopping through the fragments of a life he'd abandoned in Portland's concrete jungle. The forest around his cabin stretched endlessly in every direction, a fortress of Douglas firs and towering pines that had become his sanctuary. Here, 40 miles from the nearest neighbor, Jake had built something resembling peace. The silence was his companion, broken only by the whisper of wind through branches and the occasional call of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. This was his world now, simple, predictable, safe. He paused, wiping his brow with the back of his flannel sleeve, when the sound reached him. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks, but as he stood perfectly still, holding his breath, he heard it again. Footsteps. Deliberate, struggling footsteps crunching through the carpet of fallen leaves. Jake's grip tightened on the axe handle. In 3 years, not a single soul had ventured this far into the wilderness to find him. His nearest neighbor, old David Walsh, lived 12 miles away and respected the unspoken rule of mountain folk. Mind your own business. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied now by something else that made his blood run cold. The soft, desperate cry of an infant. Through the trees, a figure emerged like a ghost from his past. A woman, Asian American, probably in her late 20s, with long black hair hanging in disheveled strands around her pale face. She wore a thin jacket completely inadequate for the mountain weather, and her jeans were torn at the knees. But it was what she carried that stopped Jake's heart, a baby wrapped in a pink blanket pressed against her chest. "Please," she called out, her voice cracking with exhaustion and something deeper, desperation that came from the very core of survival. "I need help. My baby. She needs help." Jake stood frozen, the axe still in his hands, watching as the woman stumbled toward him. Her dark eyes were sunken with fatigue, and he could see her lips were tinged blue from the cold. The baby in her arms was crying now, a thin wail that seemed to cut through the forest silence like a blade. "You're Jake Morrison," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I've been looking for you." The words hit him like a physical blow. No one knew where he was. No one was supposed to know. He'd made sure of that when he'd disappeared from his old life, leaving behind his engineering firm, his apartment, his friends, and the unbearable weight of memories that had nearly destroyed him. "I don't know who you think I am," Jake said, his voice rusty from disuse, "but you're trespassing on private property." The woman took another step closer, and Jake could see tears streaming down her cheeks. "My name is Sarah Chen. This is Emma." She lifted the baby slightly, and Jake caught a glimpse of tiny features, a shock of dark hair, and eyes that were impossibly blue. "She's your daughter." The axe slipped from Jake's numb fingers and hit the ground with a dull thud. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting. In the distance, a storm was building, dark clouds gathering over the mountain peaks like an omen. The woman, Sarah, swayed on her feet, and Jake realized she was about to collapse. "That's impossible," he whispered. But even as the words left his mouth, he was moving toward her, his body responding to a crisis his mind couldn't yet process. "I don't have a daughter." Sarah's knees buckled, and Jake caught her just as she fell, the baby crying louder now, a sound that seemed to pierce straight through to something he'd thought was dead inside him. As he held them both, feeling the weight of this unexpected burden, Jake Morrison realized that the life he'd so carefully constructed in the wilderness was about to be shattered by the two people who had just walked out of the trees and into his world. Jake half-carried, half-dragged Sarah toward his cabin, the baby's cries growing more frantic with each step. His mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. A daughter. The word felt foreign on his tongue, impossible to reconcile with the carefully constructed isolation he'd built around himself. He'd been so careful, so deliberate about cutting all ties with his past life. The cabin appeared through the trees, a modest structure Jake had built with his own hands, rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney, and windows that looked out over the endless expanse of forest. It was meant to be a sanctuary for one, not a refuge for a collapsing woman and a crying infant. As they reached the porch, Sarah's legs gave out completely, and Jake found himself supporting her full weight while trying not to jostle the baby. "Easy, easy," he murmured, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. He kicked open the door and helped Sarah to the worn leather couch near the fireplace. The baby, Emma she'd called her, was still crying, and the sound filled the small space with an urgency that made Jake's chest tighten. Sarah's breathing was labored, and up close, Jake could see the flush of fever in her cheeks. "She's hungry," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't have any formula left. I've been traveling for days." Jake stared at the tiny bundle in Sarah's arms, his engineering mind automatically cataloging problems that needed solving. No formula, no baby supplies. The nearest store was 30 miles away, and the storm brewing outside would make the mountain roads treacherous, if not impassable. He'd lived alone for 3 years, and his cabin was stocked for one person's survival, not for the complex needs of an infant. "Look," Jake said, running his hands through his hair, "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not this baby's father. I think you have me confused with someone else." Sarah's eyes fluttered open, and Jake was struck by the intensity of her gaze. Jake Morrison, born in Seattle, graduated from Oregon State with a degree in civil engineering. You worked for Patterson and Associates until 3 years ago when you disappeared. Her voice was getting weaker, but her words were precise. You had a sister named Rebecca. The mention of Rebecca's name hit Jake like a physical blow. He took a step back, his face going pale. "How do you know about Rebecca?" "Because she told me about you," Sarah said, shifting the baby to her other arm. "Before she died." Jake's world tilted. Rebecca had been dead for 3 years. That was why he'd come to the mountains, why he'd run from everything and everyone. The guilt and grief of losing his sister and her young daughter in the car accident had been too much to bear. He'd been driving that night, had been the one to walk away while they... "That's impossible," Jake said, his voice hollow. "Rebecca died 3 years ago." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I know. I was there. I was her nurse at Portland General." She paused, struggling to catch her breath. "We became friends during her treatments. She talked about you constantly, how you blamed yourself for the accident, how you disappeared afterward. She made me promise to find you if anything ever happened to her." Jake felt the room spinning around him. "What treatments?" "Rebecca died in a car accident. The cancer came back," Sarah said quietly. 2 years after the accident. She fought it for 8 months, but she trailed off, exhaustion overtaking her again. Emma's crying intensified, and Jake found himself moving closer despite every instinct telling him to run. The baby's face was red and scrunched up, her tiny fists waving in the air. Something about those impossibly blue eyes made his chest constrict with a feeling he couldn't name. "Even if what you're saying is true," Jake said, his voice strained, "this baby isn't mine. I don't have relationships. I don't have a life that includes children." Sarah looked up at him with a sad smile. "Rebecca said you'd say that. She said you'd run from anything that might hurt you again." Her voice was getting weaker, and Jake noticed her skin was becoming more flushed. "But she also said you were the most decent man she'd ever known, and that if something happened to me, you'd be Emma's only hope." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Outside, the first drops of rain began to patter against the windows, and Jake could hear the wind picking up through the trees. The storm was coming, and with it, decisions he wasn't prepared to make. He looked at Sarah, clearly sick and exhausted, then at the baby in her arms, and realized that whatever the truth was, he was now responsible for both of their lives. "We need to get you to a hospital," Jake said finally. Sarah shook her head weakly. "The roads, and Emma needs..." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Emma's cries reached a new pitch of desperation. Jake stood frozen, watching this tiny person who had somehow become his responsibility, and felt the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around him. Jake paced the small cabin like a caged animal, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Emma's crying had escalated to a level that seemed to vibrate through his bones, and Sarah had fallen into a restless sleep on the couch, her breathing shallow and labored. The fever was clearly getting worse, and Jake's limited first aid knowledge felt woefully inadequate for the situation unfolding before him. He grabbed his cell phone from the kitchen counter, knowing it was futile. No signal, as always. The satellite phone he kept for emergencies was his only option, but even that would be useless if the storm knocked out the communication tower on the ridge. Through the window, he could see the rain had turned into a steady downpour, and the wind was bending the trees at dangerous angles. "Think, Morrison," he muttered to himself, falling back into the systematic problem-solving mindset that had served him well as an engineer. What does a baby need? Food, warmth, safety. He opened every cabinet in his kitchen, hoping for some miracle, but found only canned goods, coffee, and the basic staples of a man living alone in the wilderness. Emma's cries seemed to be getting weaker, which somehow terrified Jake more than the loud wailing. He approached the couch cautiously, looking down at the tiny bundle in Sarah's arms. The baby's face was red and blotchy, her little mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Jake had never felt so helpless in his life. "Sarah," he said softly, gently shaking her shoulder. "Sarah, wake up. What do I do? What does she need?" Sarah's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with fever. "Milk," she whispered. "She needs milk or formula, and she needs to be changed." Jake looked around his cabin desperately. He had neither milk nor diapers, and the nearest store might as well have been on the moon given the weather conditions. "I don't have any of that. I don't have anything for a baby." Sarah struggled to sit up, her face contorting with pain. "There's a bag," she said weakly. "I dropped it by the trees when I collapsed. It has some supplies." Jake's heart sank as he looked outside. The bag would be soaked by now if it hadn't already been blown away by the wind, but he had to try. He grabbed his rain jacket from the hook by the door and pulled it on. "I'll be right back," he said, though he wasn't sure if Sarah was still conscious to hear him. The storm hit him like a physical force as he stepped outside. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind nearly knocked him off his feet. He followed the path back toward where he'd been cutting wood, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he searched for any sign of Sarah's belongings. After 20 minutes of searching, he found it. A small duffel bag caught against a fallen log, soaked through but intact. Jake grabbed it and ran back to the cabin, his heart pounding from more than just the exertion. Inside, he dumped the contents of the bag onto his kitchen table. A few bottles of formula, some diapers, a change of clothes for the baby, and at the bottom, an envelope with his name written on it in handwriting he didn't recognize. Jake's hands trembled as he opened it. "Jake," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then Sarah found you, and I'm probably gone. I need you to know that Emma isn't your biological daughter, but she might as well be. Her father was never in the picture, and I've been caring for her since Sarah got sick. Sarah is dying, Jake. The cancer is aggressive and she doesn't have long. Emma needs someone who will love her and protect her, someone who understands what it means to lose everything and still find the strength to keep going. I know you think you can't love anyone again after what happened to us, but I also know that your heart is bigger than your fear. Please don't let my death be in vain. Please don't let Sarah's sacrifice be for nothing. Give Emma the chance at life that my daughter never got. She has your eyes, Jake, not genetically, but in every way that matters. She has your stubborn determination and your capacity for love, even when love seems impossible. Be the man I always knew you could be. Be the father Emma needs. All my love, Rebecca." Jake's hands shook as he set the letter down. Rebecca. His sister had been alive for 2 years after the accident, and he'd never known. She'd fought cancer alone while he'd been hiding in the mountains, too consumed with guilt to face the world. And now she was gone, really gone. and he was holding the responsibility she'd left behind. Emma's cries had grown weaker, more desperate, and Jake realized he'd been standing there reading while a baby was starving. He quickly mixed formula in one of the bottles, testing the temperature on his wrist the way he'd seen people do in movies. When he approached the couch, Sarah was barely conscious, but she managed a weak smile. "Take her," she whispered. "She needs you." Jake's hands trembled as he lifted Emma from Sarah's arms. The baby was so small, so fragile, and Jake was terrified he might hurt her. But as soon as he held her against his chest, something shifted inside him. Emma's cries quieted slightly, and when she looked up at him with those impossibly blue eyes, Jake felt something he'd thought was dead forever: hope. Jake held the bottle to Emma's lips with the concentration of a surgeon performing delicate surgery. His large, calloused hands looked absurdly oversized against the tiny bottle, but Emma latched onto it immediately, her desperate cries finally subsiding into soft, suckling sounds. The relief Jake felt was overwhelming, as if he'd accomplished something far more significant than simply feeding a hungry child. "That's it, little one," he murmured, surprised by the tenderness in his own voice. "That's better." Sarah watched from the couch with half-closed eyes, a weak smile playing on her fevered lips. "You're a natural," she whispered, though her voice was getting progressively weaker. Jake shook his head. "I don't know what I'm doing. I've never—" He trailed off, realizing he'd never held a baby before, never been responsible for another person's immediate survival. The weight of it was terrifying and somehow exhilarating at the same time. As Emma drank, Jake found himself studying her face. The letter had said she had his eyes, and while Jake couldn't see any physical resemblance, there was something about her expression, a determined focus even while feeding, that reminded him of himself. Or maybe it reminded him of Rebecca, who'd approached everything in life with the same kind of stubborn persistence. "Sarah," Jake said softly, "I need you to tell me what's really going on." "The whole truth." Sarah struggled to sit up slightly, wincing with pain. "I met Rebecca when she came back for treatment. The cancer had metastasized, and she knew she didn't have long. Her breathing was labored, and Jake could see dark circles under her eyes getting deeper. She'd been looking for you for months, but you'd covered your tracks well." Jake felt a stab of guilt. While Rebecca had been dying, he'd been so focused on his own pain that he'd made himself impossible to find. "Emma's mother was my roommate," Sarah continued, "a girl named Maria who got mixed up with the wrong crowd. She overdosed when Emma was 6 weeks old. No family, no father in the picture. I was going to put Emma in the system, but Rebecca—" Sarah paused, coughing violently. "Rebecca what?" Jake pressed gently. "She said Emma reminded her of her own daughter, same determined spirit, same way of looking at the world, like she was ready to take it on." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Rebecca was getting sicker, but she helped me care for Emma. She made me promise that if anything happened to both of us, I'd find you." Emma had finished the bottle and was now looking up at Jake with those startling blue eyes. Without thinking, Jake lifted her to his shoulder and began patting her back gently. Some instinct he didn't know he possessed guiding his movements. "But why me?" Jake asked. "I'm nobody's idea of father material. I ran away from everything after the accident. I couldn't even handle my own grief, let alone take care of someone else." Sarah's smile was sad, but knowing. "That's exactly what Rebecca said you'd say. She told me you blamed yourself for the accident, that you thought you didn't deserve happiness or love anymore." She reached out with a trembling hand and touched Jake's arm. "But she also said you were the kind of man who would walk through fire for someone you loved. She said you just needed to remember that love isn't something you deserve or don't deserve. It's something you choose." Outside, the storm was intensifying. The wind howled through the trees with a sound like wild animals, and Jake could hear branches cracking and falling. Even if he wanted to get Sarah to a hospital, the roads would be impassable now. They were completely cut off from the outside world. Emma let out a small burp, and Jake found himself smiling despite everything. "Good girl," he said softly. "Jake," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper now, "I need to tell you something else." I'm not just sick, I'm dying. The doctors gave me 6 months, and that was 4 months ago. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. What are you saying? I'm saying that Emma is going to need you sooner than you think. Sarah's breathing was becoming more labored, and Jake could see her struggling to stay conscious. I brought her here because I'm running out of time, and she needs someone who will love her the way Rebecca loved her own daughter. Jake looked down at Emma, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder, her tiny fist curled against his chest. The responsibility was enormous, terrifying, and completely outside anything he'd ever imagined for himself. But as he held her warm weight against him, feeling her peaceful breathing, something inside him began to shift. I don't know how to be a father, he said quietly. Neither did any father who ever lived, Sarah replied with a weak laugh. You just figure it out as you go. Thunder crashed overhead, so loud it shook the cabin. Emma stirred, but didn't wake, seeming to trust completely in Jake's ability to keep her safe. It was a trust he wasn't sure he deserved, but one he was beginning to realize he would die before betraying. Jake woke to silence, and that terrified him more than any sound could have. The storm had passed sometime during the night, leaving an eerie calm that felt heavy with unspoken consequences. Emma was still sleeping peacefully in his arms, but when he looked toward the couch, his heart stopped. Sarah lay motionless, her skin pale as morning frost. Jake gently placed Emma on the cushioned chair and rushed to Sarah's side, pressing his fingers to her neck, searching desperately for a pulse. It was there, but barely, thread-thin and irregular, like a butterfly's wing beating against glass. "Sarah," he whispered urgently. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered open, and Jake could see the effort it took for her to focus on his face. "Jake," she breathed, her voice so weak he had to lean close to hear her. "Is Emma?" "She's fine. She's sleeping." Jake's voice was tight with panic. "But you need medical attention. The storm's over. I can get you to—" "No." Sarah's hand found his with surprising strength. "It's too late for me. We both know that." Her eyes, though clouded with pain, held a clarity that made Jake's chest constrict. "Promise me something." Jake wanted to argue, to insist that there was still time, but looking at her, he knew she was right. He'd seen enough death to recognize it approaching. "Anything. Promise me you won't let them put her in the system. Promise me you'll keep her, raise her, love her." Sarah's grip on his hand tightened. She needs someone who understands what it means to lose everything and still choose to keep going. Jake looked over at Emma, still sleeping peacefully, unaware that her world was about to change forever. The weight of the promise Sarah was asking felt enormous, but as he watched the baby's chest rise and fall with each breath, he realized it wasn't really a choice at all. "I promise," he said, and meant it completely. Sarah's face relaxed into the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "Rebecca was right about you." Her breathing was becoming more labored, each word a struggle. "In my purse. There are papers, legal documents making you Emma's guardian. Rebecca helped me, prepared everything before." Jake felt tears he hadn't shed in 3 years burning his eyes. "Sarah, don't blame yourself for this," she interrupted, reading his expression. "This isn't your fault. This is just life happening, and sometimes life is beautiful and terrible at the same time." She paused, gathering strength for her final words. "Tell Emma about her mother. Tell her about Rebecca. Tell her she was loved by so many people who wanted nothing but the best for her." Jake nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in his throat. "And Jake," Sarah's voice was barely a whisper now, "forgive yourself for the accident. Rebecca forgave you years ago. It's time you did the same." As if summoned by some cosmic timing, Emma began to stir, making the small sounds that meant she was waking up. Sarah's eyes moved to the baby, and her smile deepened. "She's going to be amazing," Sarah whispered. "She's going to challenge you and frustrate you, and fill your life with more love than you thought possible." Emma's eyes opened, and she looked directly at Jake with that startling blue gaze that seemed to see straight through to his soul. In that moment, Jake felt something fundamental shift inside him. The man who had spent 3 years running from responsibility, from connection, from the possibility of loss, was gone. In his place was someone new, someone who would fight the world to protect the tiny person looking up at him with complete trust. Sarah's breathing became shallow, peaceful, and Jake knew she was letting go. "Thank you," he whispered to her. "Thank you for bringing her to me." But Sarah was already gone, her face serene in a way that suggested she'd found the peace she'd been searching for. Jake sat in the morning silence, holding Emma close, understanding that his life of isolation was over. He was no longer a man hiding from the world. He was a father, and everything would be different now. Emma reached up with one tiny hand and grasped Jake's finger, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never doubted that she was wanted, loved, and home. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood in the same spot where he'd been cutting wood the day his world changed forever. But now, instead of swinging an axe in solitude, he was pushing Emma in the stroller he'd bought during one of his weekly trips to town. She was babbling happily, pointing at the trees with chubby fingers and making sounds that Jake had convinced himself were almost words. The cabin had been transformed. Where once there had been only the bare necessities of a man in exile, now there were colorful toys scattered across the floor, a high chair by the kitchen table, and photographs on the mantel, pictures of Rebecca, of Sarah, and dozens of Emma as she'd grown and changed over the months. "What do you think, Em?" Jake asked, crouching down to her level. "Should we plant some flowers here? Make it pretty for when spring comes?" Emma responded with an enthusiastic squeal and clapped her hands, which Jake took as enthusiastic approval. He'd learned to interpret her moods and needs with the precision he'd once applied to engineering problems. Late-night feedings, diaper changes, teething episodes, all had become second nature. The legal paperwork had been surprisingly straightforward. Sarah had indeed prepared everything, and with the help of a family lawyer in town, Jake had officially become Emma's guardian. The social worker who'd visited had been initially skeptical about a single man living in isolation raising an infant, but Emma's obvious health and happiness had spoken louder than any concerns about unconventional living arrangements. Jake had also reconnected with David Walsh, his neighbor, who had become an unofficial grandfather figure to Emma. The old man stopped by twice a week, claiming it was just to check on them, but Jake knew he enjoyed the company as much as they did. "Your Mama Sarah was right about one thing," Jake said to Emma as he picked her up and settled her on his hip. "You are definitely challenging and frustrating." Emma responded by grabbing his beard and giggling, but she was also right about the love part. He carried her to the wooden cross he'd built and placed at the edge of the clearing, a memorial for Sarah and Rebecca, two women who had trusted him with something more precious than their own lives. Fresh wildflowers sat at its base, a weekly tradition Jake had started. "Look, Em," he said softly, "there's Mama Sarah and Aunt Rebecca. They're watching over us." Emma seemed to sense the solemnity of the moment and reached toward the cross with one small hand, babbling something that sounded almost like "Mama." Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but it was different now. Not the crushing weight of guilt and grief he'd carried for years, but something warmer. Gratitude, maybe, or simply love that had found a way to exist alongside loss. As the sun began to set through the trees, Jake looked out over the wilderness that had once been his prison and was now his sanctuary in a completely different way. He was no longer running from life. He was building one day at a time, one feeding and diaper change and bedtime story at a time. "Come on, little one," he said to Emma, who was starting to rub her eyes sleepily. "Let's go home." Home. The word meant something entirely different now. It wasn't a place to hide from the world. It was a place where love lived, where the future was being written in baby steps and first words, and the absolute trust of a child who had never known anything but safety in his arms. Jake Morrison had spent 3 years cutting down trees, trying to clear away the debris of his broken life. But it had taken a woman with a baby on her arm to teach him that sometimes the most important thing isn't what you cut down. It's what you choose to build up from the ground that's left behind.